In today's session of Patchwork Stay-cation, we will be looking at Ohio cluster block and the Confederate basket and introducing two new specialty rulers. Let's get to it. Well, you people have just been doing a marvelous job. I am overly impressed with how great your blocks are looking, the variety of color choices, and those points are just perfect. So I can't tell you how excited I am every morning. One of the first things I do, well, after I have my coffee, is I have to look at the photos to see what's going on. And if I miss commenting on some of yours, it's because you all are so busy I can't keep up with it. But trust me, I am impressed with everything you're doing. Let's take a look at our new blocks. The first block we're going to look at today is Ohio Cluster. It's on page 3 in your book. And the one in front of me is for my 30s quilt. You also can see the blue one, which is already in the quilt. And since my black quilt is finished, I didn't have to make but 2 this time. If you are using Accuquilt and you own the 8-inch cube, your A can be cut from die 1, B is die 8, and E is die 2. If you are using specialty rulers, the Good Measure quarter square ruler, your D strips you would cut 1.5 inches. Otherwise, those instructions that are in the book are the ones you're going to be working with. And we're starting to see 8ths, and pretty soon we're going to look at 16ths. And that's why, folks, you got to know that ruler you're looking at. Does it have these extra markings on it that's allowing you to cut these tighter cuts? In some of our previous blocks, we have already made this square in this 4 quarter square units assembled together, and that would be illustration 2 on page 3 in your book. I just sewed these together, a dark and a light, and a dark and a light, and that would assemble that way. What is a little bit unusual that we haven't sewn is your CDC unit, which is illustration 3. And what you've got to be doing, that's the one that you have to cut that center square. That C square gets cut 1 7/8 inches. If you don't think 1/8 of an inch makes a difference, cut it 2 and take a look at what happens. So if you cut that center C at 1 7/8, and then you're cutting, regardless of the method you use to cut your quarter squares, what you're going to do is you're going to be sewing a quarter square to that one side of the square and then one to the other side. And I'm using my Good Measure quarter square ruler. Then these little units assemble like this. So if you take a peek at how neat that goes together, now it's a little, because it's not sewn obviously. When I sew this to this and this to this, that is that illustration 3 unit that is so important. So you really just have the 2 things. You just have squares and quarter squares in this block. And I love the way the block looks, the way it turns out. You can probably put a 3rd color in some of these if you decide you want to, but let's take a look at Confederate Basket. We have talked about the Confederate basket throughout. I've mentioned a couple of blocks that I had resized and put in position of this because Confederate basket is one of your 14-inch blocks, as the Kentucky Belle was. So I have assembled, in the 30s, I have assembled a Confederate basket, and in the blue quilt, the blue basket is a free stuff pattern that you would get, because I did tell you early on that if some of you didn't want to do like the applique on the handle of the basket, I would give you an alternate basket to work with. So I decided to put that one in my blue quilt, but I'm doing the 30s one on the table. Let's take a look at Accuquilt. If you are using Accuquilt, again, that 8-inch cube comes into play. Your A is die 2, B is die 5, and D is die 3. If you are working with specialty rulers, the good measure half square ruler, I would cut B 2.5, and I would cut D 4.5. And if you have the larger version of the good measure half square ruler, your G could be cut from a 7.5-inch strip with the half square ruler. So regardless of the method that you're using, as you look at your illustration, I want to sew the square, your A square, and 2 sets of B triangles, and that is a row that I put a single triangle on. Then you'll see the next set is a pair of B triangles sewn together and a single triangle. The next one has 1 set, a single triangle, and then a single triangle. Then you put your CB unit on the sides. Then you'll put your D unit on the bottom. And here's where, if you're cutting according to your pattern, you will cut the larger size. I gave you the measurements if you're using that half square ruler. I did do a bias strip for my handle. And if you do that, I have found that even though it's straight, I can actually take the iron and curve that really pretty nice. And so what I'm going to do now is when I'm ready to stitch this down, I will just simply get it in position of where I want it. And I typically will pin this and then sew it, and then I'll put that down, stitch that down by hand. For those of you who like to do machine applique, this could be done that way. For those of you who've thrown your hands up and going, I'm not doing it, you have the other basket. So you do have choices in this. As you look at the basket in the blue quilt, there's a couple of things that I want to tell you about. The very corner of this basket, instead of having those big triangles, because I squared it off to 14, so as I squared it off and I looked at it, I thought, oh, I don't like that big triangle there. Well, hey, I know the Mary Ellen connector method, so why don't I just slap another triangle on there? So I actually cut, it doesn't matter if it's a 2, a 3, or whatever, and I just put a corner on those to kind of change it, and I love the way it reads in that little frame around the basket. When we finish these 2 blocks that we're looking at today, we only have 1 block left. So this is 11 blocks in the can. In addition to, some of you did the Betsy Ross, some of you have done the Carrie Nation, some of you did the Hovering Hawks, and your T block. So you've had other choices. So I know there's a few of you out there with 12 and 13 and 14 blocks already done. Whether you put this in or not, this is going to be one of your 14-inch position blocks. So you could take any of your 12s and frame it up to 14 if you said, I don't know if I want that basket or not. Those are your 2 blocks for this session. Now we're going to look at something entirely different. So get your drafting hat on. Let's draft. As I was looking at my blue quilt and getting ready to set it, I decided I wanted a spiky block in that quilt. And I thought, okay, that's another opportunity for us to visit drafting your own block so that you can decide what you want and the size that you wanted it. The half rectangle and the bias triangle creates the spiky units that you can see the block I've done in the blue quilt. And I also used the half rectangle and the bias triangle to create some new filler strips, the spiky filler strips that you can see in the blue quilt. And I thought, as you are approaching your filler time frame of where I'm going to have to make some of those, I wanted you to have another choice. And what I loved about using the half rectangles as my filler is there a 1-to-2 ratio, just like flying geese are 1-to-2 ratio. So I could do my 2.5 inch, stay on my grid of 2 and 4, which is what predominantly this quilt is designed on, and I could do 4-inch finished height on these units, and that filled the same spot that maybe your large half square triangle unit would fill. And I thought, oh, I'm liking that. In the archives, the block is referred to as Doris's Delight. And I did this block in the first volume of Voices of the Past eons ago, like, oh my goodness, a good 25, maybe 27 years ago. And that's what it would typically be referred to if you were to track down some old blocks. I don't know how many of you saw the movie with Leonardo and Kate in Titanic. I tell you, I was watching that movie, didn't really want to go because I already knew what happened to the boat. And so anyway, went to the movie, sat there, and truly, one of the floors is this exact block. So I renamed it the Titanic, and I even taught this on a cruise. So the quilt that's hanging on the wall is the quilt that is in a book called Spikes and Peaks. I do not have that book in stock. The book is out of print as we speak, but I'm betting you some of your local retailers would be delighted to sell you that book. So if you want that exact book and everything in it relates to the spiky tools, then you're going to need to get on the horn and start checking around with some of your local shops, or get online and look for a copy of the Spikes and Peaks book. But that Titanic quilt is a 9-inch block as it lives in the larger quilt. The table runner is a 12-inch block. Both of those live in that book, along with all the directions of how to use the half rectangle and bias triangle. And Brian's even going to give you a little tip of where to go back and look at when we introduce these, how we cut, how we sew, and all of that, so that we can keep this video a little bit shorter, but it'll give you an opportunity to really take a look at these elements in the event that you want to put them in your quilt. Now, you don't need the book for the block, but if you want the exact setting like the quilt, then perhaps it would be something that you would like. And a warning, do not buy the book if you do not have the rulers, because it is not written Accuquilt and traditional and all of that. It is written ruler only because it is published by Brewer, who is the parent company of the Good Measure rulers. I have drawn myself that cute little tic-tac-toe board, and it's actually pretty square this time because I worked on it to improve my squareness. As you're looking at this, I'm going to put a half square triangle in each of the 4 corners. So one of the things that I could tell you to do is go in the upper left-hand block and start in the bottom left corner and go up to the top. On the top right one, come at the top and go down. On the bottom right, top and go down. And on the bottom left, let's go up. Now, what I have just drawn is, oh my gosh, it's shoe fly, it's churn dash. I could put rectangles in there. I could do all sorts of things. But now I want my spiky units. So in the center, I'm going to start in the corner and come down to the center. And there's my first spiky unit. I'm going to do that in all 4 of those middle units. Now, the only thing I'm going to do is draw our square in a square, or our economy block in the center. So let's just call these guys A's, these guys B, and this one a C, just for grins. And you're like, oh, I don't know, how am I going to cut that? There's 3 of them because it's a tic-tac-toe board. So if you wanted a 12-inch block, you know that each one of those squares has got to finish 4. If I am working with rulers, A is a 4.5-inch strip, and pick up your half square ruler. B and C is a 4.5-inch strip, and pick up your 2 spiky rulers. Your center, I've already explained to you. We've talked about how you determine the size of this fellow right here. That center, if this whole unit is 4, these have to be 2. Cut 2.5 if I'm using a half square ruler. And D is the diagonal of 2. Now, I know that sounded like Greek maybe, but go back and look at some of these things, because this spiky unit is, I just think it's magic in a quilt. When we first were working on these, the 2 books, The Spikes and Peaks, and then also Christmas with Kaye, is the little quilt that is laying right here to my right, and all the quilts in these books use some of the elements from these spiky tools. For those of you who bought the sets, and there's quite a few of you that did, these 2 tools come in that set. If you want this to be a 9-inch block, we know that each one of those squares has to be 3. You already know the old 7/8, you already know rulers the halves, and you already know what your Accuquilt sizes are. And Accuquilt does have the same elements that cut the B's and C's, and it lives in the sister parts of the cubes, because you have your angles, and that would be the cube that you would need to have for those. But this is just another choice for you, because when we start looking at getting near the end and you have choices to decide about your settings and your blocks, I had the greatest urge to take this blue quilt and actually do a row of half rectangles that went around it. And I stopped myself because I still have more to do on my 30s quilt. As we prepared to tape today, I had to share my Mother's Day tulips. I want you to take a look at these. I swear, I'm watching them bloom. I mean, when I went to bed last night, they were open one space. I got up this morning and looked at them there again, and I think if we watched real close, I swear they're gonna open while we're at it. We hope you enjoy this session, and we only have 1 block left, but you want to shore up, folks, because it's a tough one. It's one that gets into 16ths, and remember I talked to you about that earlier. So have a great time looking at these 2 new blocks. Most importantly, thanks for everything you're doing to help us in passing time and enjoying making our Civil War legacy quilt in whatever fashion we have chosen. You know, we talked about that. Subscribe and hit the little button and do all those things. Be sure and do that, and for sure share those great photos. Some of you have posted my photos aren't good. We don't care about that. We just love to see what you're doing. So have a great day, and we'll see you next Sunday.